Hey sports fans, Coach Nick here, and this video is brought to you by the online BBallBreakdown membership. Click the first link in the description below to learn more and join.
Good.
The domination. The heartbreak. The anticipation. The return. As the Warriors stood on the brink of elimination, they needed a savior to lead them back into contention. And for 14 minutes, it looked like they were well on their way to getting back in the series. But as Kevin Durant attempted to push off into a drive to the basket, the one fear every Warriors fan had came true. It was obvious how serious this was. And the effect isn't only on how the Warriors will do the rest of the series, but what happens to the rest of Kevin Durant's career. How does this affect his free agency and the huge payday he was guaranteed before tearing his Achilles? I brought in Brian Sutterer, a physical medicine and rehab resident physician, to discuss the severity of Durant's injury and how it occurred. But Brian, thank you so much for joining us today to break this stuff down. I know a lot of people are really concerned, as me and you, about Kevin Durant, what he's doing right now, what his future holds. So let's actually start with the original injury, if we can, when he got hurt in a couple rounds before this. And what did you see about that? And did you feel like, what kind of injury did that do, and how might it be related to what happened last night?
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for having me. This is a really unfortunate circumstance, but I think something that we can hopefully kind of learn from here. So going back to the original injury, of course, it was diagnosed as a calf strain. There was a lot of controversy whether or not this was actually an Achilles injury that they were just covering up. But if we look at the actual mechanism and footage of when this happened, it really does seem more consistent with a calf injury. A lot of times with Achilles injury, the foot is bent more, or what we would call dorsiflexed up, and a player's trying to push off of it. If you think back to like what happened with Kobe Bryant, or when DeMarcus Cousins had his and kind of landed really hard on that foot. With Durant here, he's coming down off of a shot and his leg is much straighter up in the air. And so when that leg is straight, it's really stretching your calf muscles and puts them at more risk of a tear, as opposed to when the ankle is bent really severe, like what happened last night, that makes the Achilles more prone to injury.
I felt that same way, in a way that the way he reacted and the way they described it, it did sound consistent with what we would normally assume would be an Achilles tear or something to the Achilles. Even where he was kind of reaching, it felt like it was much lower than the calf area. But either way, I think it's safe to say that the footage we did see of him moving around in the interim before he played last night would probably indicate that it was not an Achilles issue. Like, people in that situation would not have been as mobile as he would have been in the locker room and behind the scenes, right?
Yeah, I was pretty surprised when he came back out and played last night. But, we saw him dancing beforehand. We saw him going up for these dunks. And I'll admit, he looked really good, in my opinion, early on in the game. The problem, though, there was this question of how much he had really tested the leg after he was trying to come back, and he had practiced maybe just once or twice. And so as that game progresses, you're stretching those structures, you're loading those structures more. And so it's just this cumulative risk where ultimately something like this could happen. But yeah, he was moving really well beforehand. And thinking back to that first one, when Durant grabbed his leg in the first one, it was really higher up. And most often when your calf gets torn, it's right at that spot between where the tendon inserts into the muscle. And the second time last night, we saw him grabbing much lower on the leg, much closer to where an Achilles injury occurs. It's usually just a couple of centimeters above the heel where you get an Achilles tear, because that's the area where there's not as good of blood flow. And so that's the area where the Achilles can be more prone to tearing. So different reactions to the injuries kind of can clue us into different mechanisms.
Well, walk us through what happened in last night's play when he lifts both feet to split and go off a dribble. And what happened, and how does that structure kind of fall apart? And I don't want to say explode, but you could see in the slow-mo that it was pretty much a ripple effect to the whole leg.
Yeah. So whenever he's taking off to drive in here, he goes in with his left hand, and it's that right foot that he's trying to explode or push off of. If you look at the clip, that moment where the foot is bent upwards, it's something we call dorsiflexion. And what that's doing is an eccentric load on the Achilles. And so eccentric means the tendon is lengthening, or the muscle is stretching under a load. And so that severe amount of load basically just gets that tendon to a point where it can no longer withstand, and it tears. Now, we don't, of course, know the full extent. They're saying it's at least an Achilles injury. And certainly that slow-mo video was not very reassuring with what you could see kind of rippling upwards. So he pushes off. That moment when he pushed off is, I think, when the injury occurred, as opposed to when he kind of planted then on the follow through with that right leg. It takes a split second or two for the body to kind of realize what happened. And so it really was probably that moment where he pushed off that Achilles just got stretched beyond what it could withstand and then got injured.
So when we see that rippling up and through the calf muscle, what is that happening under the skin there that makes it do that?
Yeah, so your Achilles tendon is essentially a big rubber band. And so if you imagine someone's got a rubber band pulled really tight and you just cut it with a pair of scissors, it's going to snap back. One thing afterwards, while he's down on the ground, it looks like we can see him trying to actually bend his ankle up and down. And that motion of pointing the toes downward, we call plantar flexion. And that's what the action of the calf muscle is. If your Achilles tendon is completely ruptured, it's going to be nearly impossible to actively do that. And so that's another piece of this whole puzzle that says, well, could this be completely ruptured? Or could this just be partially torn? If you've got a big, thick inch diameter rubber band and you just cut it in half a little bit, you can still get some of that snapping back on the side, but some of it might still be intact to give him at least a little bit of mobility with it.
Wow. Okay, well, that's potentially good news. They had him in a boot, I believe, and in crutches. Let me ask you this. When you assess someone who goes down like that, how easy would it be for you to tell that, oh, yeah, the whole thing is snapped without an MRI or without, any kind of invasive procedure?
Yeah, it's pretty easy, to be honest. And this is why, when Bob Myers came out last night and said, we know it's an Achilles, we don't know the full extent, either they're not telling us something they do know, or they really just don't know how torn it is. The Achilles is a huge tendon, and it sits really close to the skin. And so even just on physical exam, one of the most simple tests you can do is called a Thompson test, where Durant would lay down on his stomach and they would basically squeeze the calf muscle. And as you're squeezing the calf muscle, a normal reaction is that the foot points down. If your tendon's completely ruptured, there's no movement in the foot. And this is actually a pretty sensitive and specific test when we look at the literature. So this can really easily be done just back in the locker room.
I do want to explore the connection again between the calf injury and then an Achilles tear. And are those two things related, or are these two things completely separate incidents that are just unfortunate for Kevin Durant?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a lot of the kind of controversy here of the medical team supposedly saying this can't be made any worse. We heard some reporters after the game saying that everybody was reassured this can't get worse. There's two things to remember whenever you have any sort of a muscle injury. I think we have to assume that this was a calf strain in order to kind of have this following discussion. Whenever you get a tear in the muscle, that's basically what a strain is. And there's two components of healing. There's some scar tissue formation that kind of tries to bridge that gap in the torn muscle. And then there's the actual regeneration of the muscle itself. And so after around 10 days is when you hit the time point where that scar tissue formation is actually stronger than what the muscle would have been. And so if you re-injure that same spot kind of past that 10-day, 2-week mark, it's usually a different portion of the muscle that gets torn, as opposed to if you re-injure it in that first week, it's usually the same spot. So the fact that Durant is now a month removed from that previous injury tells us that it's likely not that exact same location. The risk, though, is that anytime you've got an injury in that kinetic chain, whether it's the knee, the hip, the ankle, the foot, whatever, you make the surrounding structures more susceptible to injury because you're completely changing the way that the joints are loaded. Also to remember, he hasn't done strenuous basketball activity for a month, and that's why there's this rehab protocol of getting back to running, getting back on the court, getting through kind of full contact, because you've got to get those other structures back in basketball shape. And so it is possible that these could be completely different in terms of where the location was, but a component of him not quite having that full rehab 100% recovery makes things like the Achilles more susceptible because of how tight it might be or just how deconditioned he might have been from being out for so long. So I think overall it's impossible to really say. I doubt it's the exact same spot, but I think the two definitely go hand in hand. The unfortunate part is you're never at a 0% risk of re-injury when something like this happens. It's everything on the balance from returning too soon and getting hurt to never coming back again. And so that medical team, the Warriors, Durant, everybody has to kind of come together and make their best, safest decision at what point you can tolerate that risk with the benefit of him being able to come back and hopefully continue the series.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the process of rehabilitation because, we saw Boogie comes back, I think, 11 months after his tear. It seems like it's 11, 12 months, even if it's a partial, let's say half of it tore, the other half doesn't. Does that seem safe to say, like he's going to be out and probably doesn't come back next year?
Yeah, I would definitely caution against saying he would be back next year. It really depends. If you look at just kind of the general healthy active population, it can be anywhere from 6 to 9 months up to a year, just depending on what the demands are of that person and how quickly they heal. There are set kind of guidelines that a person has to go through with rehabilitation. There's initial resting period. You go through strengthening, you go through stretching exercises, and there are kind of set checkpoints that someone needs to hit along the way before you can ultimately get back to even things just like running on a flat surface. And so it's hard to predict in every circumstance what exactly that individual is going to require in terms of their physical abilities when coming back from an injury like this. But I think it's safe to say, next season, even if he does come back later on, is certainly going to be affected. There's been some research looking at actually NBA players and how they return from an Achilles injury. And the general consensus is that first season back, they do pretty poorly. They have decrease in their player efficiency rating. They definitely don't do as well. But if they are able to return, that usually by that second or third season back, they hit a similar performance rating to their kind of healthy controls that weren't previously injured with an Achilles tear. And so there is some hope. The younger the person is, the better it is for their recovery chances. But it's really looking more kind of 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road, what they're going to be doing in terms of judging their long-term health.
Well, thank you so much, Brian, for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. And also, make sure you check out his YouTube channel. A lot of great stuff on biomechanics and the movement and how all those things work with sports injuries. So thanks, Brian. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
You got it. And don't forget, sports fans, at BBallBreakdown, we're not a channel, we're a conversation. You in? Are you in, Brian?
I'm in.
Sports fans, Coach Nick again, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then I've got a new online basketball membership where I share with you the best of what NBA teams are doing to help you be more successful on the court. Click the first link in the description or the pinned comment below to learn more. And don't forget to like and subscribe and let me know how you feel about today's video. Check your settings to make sure you get notified each time we drop a new one. After all, at BBallBreakdown, we're not a channel, we're a conversation. You in?